It's time for the Daily Stand-Up Podcast presented by AgileDad with your host, Lee Henson. Without any further ado, let's get started. Someone asked me a question that stirred me, and I'm going to record an episode about this, and I don't know whether I should or not, and I pondered this one for probably a couple of weeks, but then I finally decided, I'm just going to go for it. Someone asked me about why my podcast is always 15 minutes or less. What benefit can you get out of it so quickly? And if I intended to continue to follow that format, if I was going to expand the format, and how they could best leverage this podcast as a tool. Now, I want to give you the top 3 ways that you can leverage the Daily Stand Up Podcast as a tool. But before I do, I'm going to answer those questions real quick. So the first question was, why is it always 15 minutes or less? It has to do with attention span. There's just a lot of folks out there who don't necessarily have a lot of time, and they want to get maximum value out of a topic that they hope to learn more about, but they just don't have time to spend 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours. I mean, I've seen some long podcasts, and it's great to be able to just chime in for a few minutes, 5, 7, 9 minutes, get the information that you need and head on out and be on your way. And that was the intent behind it. So the intent behind it was to make it much like a daily scrum, a daily stand-up, where you could come in, gather the most relevant and important information that you need, and then be about your business. And it was always intended to be that way. It was never intended to be any other way, which is really, really interesting. Do I intend to change it? No, absolutely not. The only exception is when I do Agile Expert Series. So if I have a guest on like Ken Schwaber, Mike Cohn, Jeff Sutherland, one of those guys, I'll definitely give them more than 15 minutes to say what they want to say because they're pillars in the community, right? So anyone who's a pillar in our community that wants to join me on the podcast, you're certainly welcome, and we will expand for more than 15 minutes for that, just to give you time to get your message out. But let's get to those tips. I want to get to the 3 tips because I think these tips are really going to make sense. And I'm going to give you the most important one first. So I have a dear friend who told me that he was striving at work to become the go-to person for Agile. Like he wanted to be the leader of the Agile Center of Excellence within his company. And he expressed to me that one of the tools that he used frequently was the podcast. And when he told me how, it blew me away. He said, he says, if people come to me and they have a question, he says, sometimes I know the answer. He says, sometimes I don't. He says, and if I don't know the answer, instead of openly admitting that I don't know the answer, he says, I turn around and tell him, that is an amazing question, and I would love to give it more thought. He says, so is there any way that I can have 15, 20, 30 minutes, whatever he feels he needs, and compose my thoughts and come back to you with something that's a little more eloquent than if I just answered it on the fly? And of course, the resounding answer is always, yeah, no problem. So then what does he do? He goes back to a work area, puts on his headphones, searches on the search bar at dailystanduppodcast.com for the topic that he's looking for, finds 8 to 10 episodes on that topic, listens to a couple, maybe picks one and says, no, that's not it, and picks the second one, that's a good one. Listens to it, takes some notes, and then goes back and gives a thoughtful response to the person that asked the original question. Now, I know what you're thinking. People say, isn't that cheating? And I'm like, well, definitely not. If you listen to the podcast and you learn something from it and then you convey and teach someone else, in my world, that's not cheating. In my world, that's education, and that's awesome. So I tell people all the time, the first way you can leverage and the most important way you can leverage the podcast is to use it as a tool to educate yourself and then use it as a tool to make you the wisest person in the room so that you can educate others. Okay, that's number 1. Number 2, there are a few large companies out there, including Amazon and others, that have discovered that for years they had a book club, so to speak, within the development teams or within the Agile teams or within teams in general. And what they found is that while some people love reading books, other people just didn't have the time or didn't have the interest, and interest was waning in covering one chapter at a time and taking weeks or months to get through a book. So some of these groups have done away with, I shouldn't say done away. They made it less frequent to do book clubs. And instead, in place of it, they've gone in and said, let's do a podcast listening party. And the way they do this is they'll teach everyone about the podcast that exists. They'll have them go to dailystanduppodcast.com. They will have them, they'll assign them a topic. Maybe this week we'll learn more about retrospectives, next week about sprint planning, whatever the topic is. And then they'll ask them to go through and find one or two relevant episodes and listen to those. And on Wednesday, they all get together. They do a lunch and learn. If they're working from home, they order Uber Eats. If they're in the office, they get treated to a nice lunch. And the company supports them for lunch, and they have discussion around a topic. And the beautiful thing about that is that we can identify topics where we feel like we have areas for growth or areas for improvement. And we can leverage the podcast to have people go and listen. And for some of those key topics like retrospectives, you might find 50 episodes on retrospectives or more. So it's just one of those things where if you listen to the first one and it's not your cup of tea, go to the second one or the third one. Chances are you're going to find something that's exactly what you hope to hear. And that's a wonderful thing. So I challenge you in your companies to teach your teams about the retrospective and have them maybe one day a week after the stand-up talk about which episode they listened to and what their key takeaway was. If they could do that and keep it short, keep it brief, 30 seconds per person, and it will allow you to have expanded learning about topics that are important. So that's number 2. That's another great way to use the podcast. And then number 3, I've had many organizations and many people tell me that they use the podcast for research. And one of the things that was pretty incredible, I have a dear friend who works for NPR, and she does a lot of the fact checking for the political stories that go on NPR. And what she found was when she went to my podcast, she says the one thing that was really of interest to her is that she listened to several hundred episodes over time and said that not once did an episode contradict another episode. They were always in line with one another. She said there were some reoccurring themes, which is true, but anytime there's a reoccurring theme, a lot of times it's coming from a different slant or a different perspective. So it makes it even better to listen to the podcast because then you have this tool that you can do research. And if there's not a podcast episode out there for a specific topic, you can always let us know, and I'm happy to record one the next week. So you don't have to wait long to get the answer that you were looking for. And that's another beautiful thing. Now, going forward, how do we plan to leverage the podcast? That was the last question. And one of the things that we're planning on doing now, well, I guess there's multiple. So one thing right away is we are going to start publishing a blog post that goes with 1 or maybe 2 episodes a week. We're going to send out a helpful email, almost like a newsletter, that has some information that will help guide you based on the topics that we hear the most about that week, right? Whether it's through students in class or whether it's through emails we receive, we want to make sure we're covering the things that are most important to you. Another big thing is we're actually taking all of these podcasts, every single episode, where we're currently in the 970s and close to 980. And we are taking those podcast episodes and we are feeding all of that information into AI. So that way, at some point, we can have an AgileDad.ai of some kind that you can go to and ask questions, and it will be able to answer the questions in my tone or in my voice. And hopefully it includes the dad jokes, and it'll give you the information that you're looking for. So that way you may not have to hire an Agile coach for hours and pay lots of money. You'll have these answers right at your fingertips, and then you can leverage the Agile coach for the topics that are a little more tough. So lots of powerful things, but the podcast really truly is a labor of love. I mean, it's 5 days a week, and it's a lot of information. One other question I commonly get asked, I'll answer for you, is do you actually record this podcast every day? I'm going to lift up the curtain and tell you a secret. I usually record 1 day a week unless we have special topics that people bring up, in which case I'll record on a morning and replace that episode with the episode on the topic that someone requested, right? But the big deal is we do spend, oh my goodness, probably several minutes, 10 to 20 minutes on each episode, curating it, making sure the sound's good, making sure if there's any bumps in the road that we get those ironed out, and getting them uploaded so that they can be here waiting for you when the time comes. So I hope that tackles most of your questions. There's one last one that I see here that I omitted. I apologize. I'll answer this question now. Someone asked, who do you allow to be a guest on your podcast, and how do you reach out if you qualify? Here comes the fun part. Are you ready? Anyone who has a voice that's clear and a quiet place to record can be a guest on my podcast. If you have something that you want to talk about, you can certainly be a guest. We would love to have you on the podcast. And we record generally on Fridays. And when we record, we will have you talk about your topic. It's going to stay under 15 minutes. We're going to ask you 3 questions about the topic, just like a daily Scrum meeting. It's pretty smooth, pretty easy. And then we'll tag you when it gets rolled out so that way you can show off to all your friends and let them know that you are on one of the top 5 business podcasts. And it just makes it fun for everyone. So we look forward to hearing from you. We want you to be on the podcast and we want you to talk about the topic that's most relevant to you. That's going to do it for this episode. I hope that it helped you understand and learn more. If there is something that you want us to cover, feel free to reach out. Learn more at AgileDad.com. We would love to hear from you. And as always, we encourage you to stay healthy, stay well, and stay agile, my friends. Until next time, do take care.